Today, we're tackling a question that has, for centuries, literally determined the fate of nations.
I mean, it's a huge question, right? How do you hold a country together when you have all these different languages, different cultures, and different ethnic groups all living in the same place? How do you stop disagreements from blowing up into full-blown division or even war?
So, to get to the bottom of this, we're going to look at two small countries, Sri Lanka and Belgium. Now, on the surface, they look kind of similar, both diverse, both democracies, but, and this is the key, they took completely opposite roads when it came to sharing power. One path, well, it led to decades of terrible conflict. The other, a super complex but ultimately peaceful arrangement.
Okay, let's start with Sri Lanka. And this story, it's really a powerful warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when power isn't shared.
So to really get what went wrong, you gotta look at the numbers. Sri Lanka is this diverse island nation, but there's a really clear majority group. You've got about 74% of the population who are Sinhala speakers. Then, the biggest minority group are the Tamil speakers, making up about 18%. And this imbalance, well, this became the absolute heart of the country's political problems. So, picture this. It's 1948. Sri Lanka gets its independence. The leaders of the Sinhala community, the majority, decide to go down a path called majoritarianism. Now, what is that? Well, the idea is simple, and honestly, it can sound pretty democratic at first. The majority rules, right? But what it meant in practice was a government formed by the Sinhala majority, working for the Sinhala majority, and completely, totally ignoring the Tamil minority.
And look, this wasn't some subtle thing that just kind of happened. No, this was a series of very deliberate, very specific policy decisions. In 1956, bam, they passed the Sinhala Only Act, which basically throws the Tamil language out the window. Then, in the 70s, you get these preferential policies. Suddenly, if you're a Sinhala applicant, you have a better shot at getting into university or landing a government job. The state even started to actively protect and promote Buddhism, the religion of the majority. I mean, can you imagine? Each one of these moves was another step in pushing the Tamil community to the sidelines, making them feel like strangers in their own home. So it's no surprise that by 1983, after decades of this, all that resentment just boiled over. And it sparked a brutal, terrible civil war that would go on for nearly 30 years. Okay, so now let's completely switch gears and look at Belgium. They were facing a similar kind of challenge, different groups, different languages, though maybe not as lopsided. But their leaders came up with a totally different solution. Not a takeover, but a carefully built arrangement. So, in Belgium, the country's mostly split between Dutch speakers up north, that's about 59% of the people, and French speakers in the south, who are about 40%. You've also got a small German-speaking community too. But here's the twist. Even though the Dutch speakers were the overall majority, the French-speaking minority had historically been wealthier and more powerful, so that created its own whole set of tensions. So instead of one group just trying to steamroll the other, the leaders in Belgium chose a different path altogether: accommodation. They basically looked at the situation and said, you know what? The only way this country stays in one piece is if we respect everyone's interests. And this wasn't just talk, not some empty promise. They literally re-engineered their entire government to make it happen. So how on earth did they pull this off? This is where it gets really, really interesting. Between 1970 and 1993, they actually changed their constitution 4 different times. First, they made it a rule the central government must have an equal number of Dutch and French-speaking ministers. That way, no single group can make decisions all by themselves. Second, they gave a ton of power to the state governments, making them pretty much autonomous. Third, for the capital, Brussels, they set up a whole separate government with, you guessed it, equal representation. And finally, as if that wasn't enough, they created this whole third layer of government called the community government. Its whole job is to handle stuff like culture, education, and language for each group. I know, it sounds incredibly complicated, right? And it is. But that complexity is the whole point. They deliberately chose to make things complicated in order to keep things stable. And you know what? It worked. It kept the peace, it prevented a civil war. So, when you put these two stories side by side, Sri Lanka's tragedy and Belgium's super complicated solution, what's the big takeaway? Well, both stories point us to one single powerful idea: the principle of power sharing. And at its core, power sharing is, well, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's all about designing a system of government where you don't let power get concentrated in just one place or in the hands of just one group. Instead, you deliberately spread it out, you distribute it to make sure that different groups all have a real stake in how the country is run.
Okay, but why would a country choose to do this? It seems like a lot of work. Well, there are two big reasons, two different ways of thinking about it. The first is what we call a prudential reason. That's just a fancy way of saying it's a practical, strategic move. You share power because, hey, it reduces the chance of conflict, it keeps the country from falling apart, and it just leads to better, more stable outcomes for everybody. Simple as that. But then there's the moral reason. This argument is different. It says that power sharing is a good thing in and of itself, because it is the very spirit of democracy. A truly democratic government isn't just about majority rule. It's about making sure that all citizens, not just the ones in the majority, have a voice and feel represented. And this whole idea, it's not some one-size-fits-all thing. Power sharing can look really different depending on the country. For example, you can share power horizontally. That's the classic separation of powers between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Checks and balances. You can also share it vertically, dividing it up between different levels of government, like the central government, state governments, and local ones. Just think of India's massive three-tiered system. Sometimes you see power shared among specific social groups. A great example is Lebanon, where the system is set up to guarantee representation for both Christians and Muslims. And of course, probably the most common way we see it is when political parties have to share power by forming alliances and coalition governments to rule together. At the end of the day, looking at Sri Lanka and Belgium, this stark contrast leaves us with a really fundamental question. And it's a question for any democracy, whether it's brand new or centuries old. I mean, the lesson here couldn't be clearer, right? Real unity in a country doesn't come from the majority just forcing its will on everyone else. No, it comes from finding ways to include everyone, to give everyone a seat at the table. Power sharing isn't a sign of weakness, far from it. It's what actually makes a democracy strong, resilient, and fair. So, Sri Lanka and Belgium, they offer two completely different answers to the same problem, and they had dramatically different results. But this isn't just some history lesson. It's a real, live challenge that countries all over the world are still grappling with right now. And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. What is the right balance between the will of the majority and the rights of the minority?